Good morning to those joining us from the United States and Latin America. Good afternoon to those joining from Europe, Western Asia, and Africa. And good evening to those joining from Asia and the Pacific. My name is Jacob Batiki, and I'm the Director of Education and Advocacy of the University of Miami Public Health Policy Lab. The UN Public Health Policy Lab and the AHF Global Public Health Institute are honored to welcome you to our Emerging Challenges in Global Public Health webinar series, a forum dedicated to knowledge exchange, rigorous discussion, and actionable solutions. It is with gratitude that I extend a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists today. Dr. Abdul Rahman Al-Kashan of the Permanent Mission of the State of Kuwait to the United Nations Office and Consulate General in Geneva, Ms. Nur Hafiza M.D. Hamza of the Permanent Mission of Malaysia to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, Mr. James Love of Knowledge Ecology International, Ms. Sangeeta Shashikant of the Third World Network, Dr. Maria Juliana Tenorio Quintero of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Colombia, and Ms. Roberta Vargas de Moraes of the Ministry of Health of Brazil. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, Mr. Guilherme Ferrari Faviero. Mr. Faviero is a lawyer, advocate, and policy expert focused on global health governance, equity, and institutional reform. He currently serves as a director of the AHF Global Public Health Institute. Mr. Faviero, we are deeply grateful for your leadership and contributions to reforming the global health architecture, and of course for guiding today's conversation. Once again, thank you all for being here. We look forward to an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. Mr. Faviero, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you to all of the participants for being here today for this important discussion that will precede the upcoming negotiating session in Geneva. The Intergovernmental Working Group on the WHO Pandemic Agreement is entering a decisive phase. With only months remaining before the next World Health Assembly, member states face a compressed timeline to finalize the Pathogen Access and Benefit-Sharing Annex, a prerequisite for the agreement's adoption, as well as other key components of the agreement, including the coordinating financial mechanism. As governments prepare for the third IGWG meeting, central questions remain. Can it be concluded in time and with enough substance to establish an effective framework with enforceable mechanisms that ensure equity in practice and not just in principle? More broadly, questions of other member states will seize this moment to use the pandemic agreement and the PABS Annex as an instrument that can effectively address the inequities laid bare by COVID-19 and other pandemics, or whether the process will fall short of delivering on necessary, binding, and enforceable commitments. This follow-up panel builds on an earlier discussion on the PABS Annex and will provide an opportunity for member states and civil society to reflect on progress, to address potential challenges, and to discuss the stakes that are on the line for forging a more equitable global health architecture. As an opening session, this webinar is titled, as an opening question, this webinar is titled Equity on the Line, the PABS Annex and the Future of the Pandemic Agreement. This is a title which one of my colleagues reacted to as perhaps being rather provocative, implying that equity is in danger and that it is perhaps too early to tell in the negotiation process of where we stand. So with that in mind, why don't we open this discussion by giving the member states representatives here an opportunity to address the state of equity with respect to global health and how what is being negotiated through the PABS Annex and the pandemic agreement more broadly can advance global health equity in meaningful ways. Would anybody like to volunteer to start?
We should hear from
Dr.
first.
Al-Kashan and then Nurfiza. The floor is yours, Dr. Al-Kashan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ferrari, and it's my honor to join the distinguished panel and colleagues from across the regions. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. From the start, the ongoing discussion on the PABS Annex are a defining moment for all of us. Not only because they determine how the pathogen, the data will be shared, but because they will show whether our global health system can translate equity from aspiration into action. From our perspective, the purpose of the Annex is to create a functioning multilateral system, and not just another declaration of a principle. This system must, however, get one fundamental balance right: the rapid structure sharing on the pathogen materials and sequence information on one side, and the predictable, timely, and enforceable benefit sharing on the other side, including times outside declared emergencies. This balance, from our perspective, has been reaffirmed in informal consultation and discussions. Many regions have stressed that equity cannot be an outcome negotiated during crisis, but a design feature that functions before, during, and after emergencies. What we therefore expect from our upcoming discussions and negotiations to deliver a productive outcome, a clear and achievable annex for a predictable access to the countermeasures through the commitments and contractual commitments, not relying on a goodwill and good intentions. We also expect there is some administrative contracting system through the WHO that binds commercial users for fair obligations, supply commitments, tiered proportional financial contributions, and non-exclusive licensing and technology transfer and know-how where applicable. We also would like to expect and we like to see a long-term track for capacity building, so that the region in the global south especially can become producers, not only recipient and consumers. We recognize this is an ambitious, but without embedding equity from the start of this value chain, no system will be trusted or sustainable. That's the principle that makes the PABS both viable and fair. Yet we must approach this with realism, focusing on progress that is achievable with the current mandate and context. Back to you, Mr. Fadil. Thank you.
Perfect. I believe Ms. Nur Hafiza Hamza had her hand up as well. I invite you to share your perspective on this question of how can the PABS agreement and the pandemic agreement more broadly advance global health equity in meaningful ways.
Thank you, Guy. And first of all, thank you for organizing this event. Feel very privileged to be in this webinar. And I agree with the title, Equity on the Line, because this is a PABS Annex that will determine whether equity will be operationalized under the pandemic agreement. I agree with my fellow panelists' statement earlier, but I would like to add a bit more on the deliverables of the PABS Annex, mainly the equal footing, which I highlight in bold, between access and benefit sharing, that the system must promote the rapid sharing of PABS material and sequence information while guaranteeing that benefits derived from such sharing are distributed fairly and rapidly. PABS Annex should also preserve the sovereign rights of states over their biological resources, which means states are providing facilitated access to their genetic resources under a multilateral system, and it will need to be consistent with the CBD and Nagoya Protocol rules. For PABS to be operationalized in equity, it has to embed legal certainty for all participants in the PABS system, both providers and users, to ensure compliance, trust, and the effective implementations. There should also be clear benefit sharing arrangements, including well-defined triggers for when benefit sharing obligation arise, who is giving the benefits, and guidance how those benefits should be shared, should be embedded in this annex for implementation, whether it's monetary and non-monetary. So the annex have to be detailed to make sure that equity is something that could operationalize and it's not merely a principle. I stop there. Thank you.
Let me bring in Ms. Roberta Vargas from Brazil. If you can briefly, and Brazil has been such an important country along with Malaysia as well, and Colombia, in advancing equity in these negotiations. From your perspective, what is the state of global health equity, and how can the pandemic agreement and the PABS Annex help to advance this cause in a meaningful way?
First of all, thank you for inviting Brazil to be in this panel. It's for sure a very good timing for us to discuss right before the third IGWG meeting. So for Brazil, we've been very engaged in these negotiations, as well as we were engaged in the INB. We've been making sure that not only the Foreign Affairs Ministry is there with their diplomats, but also always someone from the Ministry of Health from Capital is going to the negotiation. So for us, it's a very important discussion. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. So for Brazil, we think that the main purpose of the PABS system is very clear, that in the next pandemic, we don't repeat the same mistakes that we've made during the COVID pandemic. So basically making sure that no one is left behind without access to vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics. So in a few words, as Brazil, we've been defending the need for a PABS system that is truly functional, predictable, and binding. So as established in the pandemic agreement, in the main text, Article 12, we cannot go back. We cannot suddenly decide that it's not binding anymore. So we definitely need to have a binding system that where the sharing of pathogens, like Fisa said, goes on equal footing, goes hand in hand with fair and timely sharing of benefits. So both sides of this equation must work for us to have a truly functional and equitable system, PABS system. Thank you.
And before we move on, and thank you for that response, Roberta, to civil society representatives, Dr. Juliana, is there anything that you would like to add from the Colombian perspective?
Thank you so much for the panel, for the invitation to the Colombian delegation. And I guess what I have to add, because I agree with my previous colleagues that already spoke, and they spoke very, very clearly on what PABS means, is just to see the PABS as a tool of the pandemic agreement. So it's true, of course, that we're negotiating an annex to the pandemic agreement, but Colombia sees this as a system. So we have always engaged in these negotiations 3 years ago, within the pandemic agreement negotiations, and see the whole chain of the tools that we are negotiating. So we have always said that we need to see things from research and development to the actual development of countermeasures, and to the delivery of those countermeasures. And within that change, PABS, of course, is one of the most important tools to build and just to feed every step of Articles 9 to Article 13. So that's the reason why we of course we are engaging in the PABS negotiation in that view, like seeing PABS as a tool, and a tool that needs to be effective, and of course having in mind what Fisa was also mentioning in terms of sovereignty of national resources, but also that even though we are following CBD, here we have a different component that is global health perspective. So that component, you don't see it in the CBD. So that's what we're trying to do, just to feed what already the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol already states, but with a global health perspective. So I think that's it. It's just one of the tools that we have within the pandemic agreement to actually construct effective measures for PPR, and that's the way we see PABS within these negotiations. Thank you.
And now, thank you for that response, Dr. Juliana, and thank you for your presence. Now we'll turn to James and Sangeeta from Knowledge Ecology and TWN, which have been consistent voices throughout the IND and now the IGWG process as well. From your perspective, what is necessary for the PABS Annex and the pandemic agreement more broadly to actually deliver on equity in practice and not just in principle? And maybe for your response, tell a little bit about your organizations to the audience for those members who may not be familiar with your work.
You want Sangeeta is the one that's been the deepest involved in this. And do you want to go first or second, Sangeeta?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I hope you can hear me. So thank you very much for having Third World Network on this panel. Third World Network is a civil society organization. We have a small office in Geneva. We monitor various international negotiations. We do research, analysis, and advocacy, depending on the issue. And then we try and also connect with regional and national bodies to create awareness. I think in terms of your topic, I think it is true with the PABS negotiations, depending on what is finally agreed. In that sense, equity is really on the line. What I would say is that when we go into the PABS negotiations, it's very important to kind of go back to where we came from, right? What did we see during COVID-19? What have we seen during Ebola? What have we seen during Mpox? All these different health emergencies have happened. And what we see is developing countries and even often WHO stockpiles, we are all at the end of the queue when it comes to access. Meanwhile, some countries have entered into advanced purchase agreements. They have supply, they have stockpiles, all of this agreed in advance with manufacturers. So we have to address this very, very important issue. And I think in COVID-19, we saw worldwide there was a big challenge in terms of getting access. And only some countries were at the front of the queue, whereas the rest of the countries were at the back of the queue. So we have to address this. Second point is we have to address the availability. We also have to address the affordability. Because during these health emergencies, when there is a great demand, suddenly you see the price have shot up, right? And often beyond what many governments are able to afford. But because they are in desperate needs, they will spend that money, but then it's highly inequitable situation to be in. The third challenge we faced was that during health emergencies, we will find that demand will outstrip supply because there's limited there's limited supply, and the needs of countries cannot be addressed. And when there were calls to do licensing to developing country manufacturers, this was not addressed. And if you participated in the informal IGWG meetings, I think that one thing that was consistently raised by the resource person was the need to diversify production. And this is very, very important because we need to expand the supply options. So this is the context that we are operating in. And the PABS really offers a concrete mechanism to operationalize equity, right? Equity with legal certainty, I would say. And with legal certainty, we will need to have standard contracts when you share materials and sequences. We will need to make sure that there are proper transparency and accountability mechanisms for the effective operationalization of all of these contracts, the different systems that we are going to be putting in place. But I would say that this presents a unique opportunity for WHO members to walk the talk. We hear a lot about international collaboration, international solidarity. So this is the moment for us to come together and to develop a system that actually can really deliver for genuine international cooperation. So to walk the talk, but it's the moment for us to put numbers, percentages, what is going to be delivered. And if we do it the right way, actually, I think it's a win-win situation for everyone because we are then truly trying to achieve the objectives of the pandemic agreement, which is preparedness and response. So I think, in terms of elements, We will definitely need standard contracts. We will need accountability mechanisms. We will need transparency for the entire system to work effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. James, let's bring you into this discussion.
Yeah, first I'd like to say I agree with everything that Sangeeta said, so I'll offer some other comments. And also point out that Sangeeta has been involved in this debate for a long time, including she played a really important role in the development of the PIPS framework, which was really the model that's being pursued right now in the annex right now for the pandemic agreement. I just on the equity side, as other people have mentioned, the whole agreement has different provisions in it that are really relevant for equity, not just the PABS thing. In some ways, a lot of the focus on the equity has ended up in the PABS because in the negotiations, efforts to have stronger equity provisions on other parts of the agreement, like on the technology transfer or the intellectual property right or the procurement side, were watered down in the negotiations, and so they kept kicking the can or down the road. When things were blocked in that area, then the role of the PABS became more and more important because the equity provisions just weren't very strong in the other parts of the agreement. It's not like they're not there, but they're just not very strong. We were pretty unhappy with the final language on the technology transfer. I mean, not everything was disappointing, but I mean, overall, we didn't get a very high grade in the way things turned out. On the I will say, if you look at the PIPS framework as kind of the early model that this is based on, one thing you'll notice in the PIPS framework was that there was this option of things you could do to satisfy, like the agreement to get access to the information from the samples from the PIPS framework. And one thing that the vaccine or drug companies generally did not do was the option to do technology transfer, licensing, patents, and things like that. What they tended to gravitate toward were the free and the reduced price obligations that they'd have. Another thing that we wanted to mention is if you look at the overall pandemic agreement as a whole, there's a lot of areas where the implementation will determine how actionable it is and how useful it is. And we're not there yet. I mean, first of all, we don't have, we're not even at the point of ratification yet. But then moving forward, you also have provisions there for annexes and protocols and amendments. And it's a framework. It's really, in many ways, it's a very appealing thing because it has a lot of sort of things it can do, but a lot of the stuff will have to be decided and it's I think it's normal because it's such a complicated area and there's so many moving parts that sometimes you have to wait till the implementation. You can't put everything into treaty language. Some things will have to be done through the implementation. Like if you look at, for example, the supply chain provisions and things like that. One thing I wanted to mention is that in the treaty, the European Union threatened to walk out of that negotiation if they didn't get Article 20 on voting provisions in the agreement. What the European wants to do is to be able to have sort of different voting rights than other countries have, essentially, in the agreement. And why is that important? Is because you need, for some things, you need a supermajority, in some cases 75% of the people voting to make certain amendments or adopt certain provisions in the agreement going forward. And that would give the European Union potentially the ability to block things that it didn't really like. And given the role of the European Union in negotiations on the equity provisions, particularly on anything related to intellectual property or technology transfer, I think that would be a cause we would have for concern. But I mean, that's something that they're raising in all sorts of negotiations, not just this one. The annex is being negotiated right now. It's not as transparent as it should be. I mean, we've been trying to get more openness in terms of the way the negotiations take place. It's unfortunate that that you have to look at the World Intellectual Property Organization as a better model for transparency than you find at the World Health Organization. You'd think the World Health Organization would be more transparent and have more access. Instead, it's the exact opposite. I mean, they limit the number of people that can even attend the meetings in some sessions to like one person or something like that. And then they or don't let them in at all, or they have too many of the plenaries basically are closed. And it's really a pretty significant contrast to the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is full of lobbyists from industry, but still operates. And the transparency, I think, at WIPO benefits civil society. And I think, ironically, I think in the WHO negotiations, some of the people blocking transparency think the transparency it enables industry, and I think that's a misunderstanding. I think that the more transparent it is, the more people. It's complicated. The more people hear the debates. And debates are also WHO is facing a lot of criticism by people. I can stop there, but if I'm going too far. But I think the transparency of the negotiations is a consequential thing to do, as it has to do with the reputation of the WHO as well and the agreement.
So no, I was going to add that James is raising in several questions that I hope that we can get to them all. You raised the issue of the need for cooperation. And how the governance of the agreement has been structured, the dynamics between certain groups of countries, and that's something that I think I'll open up the floor shortly. You raised the issue of transparency and the need for transparency, and then the issue of process and how the pandemic agreement and the INB negotiations and the PABS negotiations have fared relative to other international processes. But why don't we start with maybe getting the take of a couple or two member states representatives? There have been lots of discussions that have taken place between the last IGWG and the upcoming IGWG, right? What is the general mood going into IGWG 3? What are some of the key challenges that you foresee? And what do you believe needs to be done to advance the process, right? What are you hoping to get out of this upcoming negotiation session? Would anybody like to begin with that response? Dr. Maria Juliana?
Thank you. I feel very, this is very formal when you call me Dr. Maria Juliana. Okay. Thank you so much for that. Okay. And I guess I'm going to start with a positive note on IGWG 3, and perhaps my colleagues can complement what I'm going to say. I guess IGWG has started with a different perspective or working methods than INB. It is, of course, true that INB was like the first major negotiation for WHO after the Tobacco Convention. So it wasn't something that Secretariat or delegates at WHO were familiar with, like to be involved in a negotiation of legally binding instruments. So we have learned from over 3 years working for the amendments of the IHR and the pandemic agreement itself. So what I've noticed is that last meeting was the informals that took place in October, and there and in member states were able to engage not only between themselves but also with resource persons into very difficult questions, because now the negotiation has moved into very technical details. The pandemic agreement was also a very technical discussion, but also with some political components, as you have mentioned before, and it was very, it reflected a lot of what happened, and of course it had to reflect what happened with COVID-19. So what I saw, and this is just a personal perspective, not even a Colombian perspective, that during the informal there were some positive vibes, if you might say so, between delegations and trying to engage with each other in these very technical and difficult questions. You have to remember that we're moving like the CBD talks and everything like from our realm or from a different organization to WHO, which is not used to have these intense conversations. So it's a learning process, I guess, for many delegates and the secretariat. And the other positive thing that I would like to highlight is that we have a text. It didn't like. Of course, we only have the text for over like a couple of days, but it's a short text. So just to be able, and that was a demand of many developing countries during informals and during EQUIC to have a text to start engaging in textual negotiations in EQUIC 3, because otherwise we won't be able to make the deadline that we have for next assembly. So we appreciate the bureaus, and that is something that internally in Colombia we appreciate, that the bureau has come out with the text. Of course, it's not a perfect text, but it's a basis for negotiation, and we really wanted to start engaging in textual negotiations for EQUIC 3, because we don't have that much time. If you count the days, there are not more over than 20 days to finalize the annex. And just a final reflection, I guess what is needed more, and perhaps we need to have more time between November and December, it would be informal talks. And that should take place between EQUIC 3 and EQUIC 4. And of course, the involvement of, as some of you were saying, of civil society. Colombia has been very vocal in terms of having an open process. We have tried many times during INB. We're trying again during EQUIC. So hopefully we can have an open process like this is going to be decided during the next meeting. But to us, and we have been very appreciative of the involvement of civil society. It has enriched the process, and to us, that's the rule in other processes. So we're basically the exception. So I leave it at that, and hopefully my colleagues will complement. Thanks.
So let me, excuse me. So let me bring in Roberta. I mean, from your vantage point, and to build on what Maria Juliana has added, what conditions must be in place for the annex to be concluded by the target deadline? And more specifically, what do you think should be accomplished, or how does the Brazilian delegation perceive needs to be accomplished in IGWG 3 to keep the negotiations on track?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very complex issue, because time is not on our side, right? We have this really tight deadline timeline, and we agreed to a timeline in IGWG 1, and then now we are entering in IGWG 3, and we have to follow it, so that otherwise we are not going to meet the deadline of May 2026. And we are in line with what Juliana said, that Colombia and Brazil is also very eager and very eager to start text-based negotiations. It's obviously not a perfect text, but it's something to start with, and we are very happy about that. So you asked about the target deadline. So it's I think it's very important that we meet that, not only to allow the pandemic agreement as a whole to enter into force, but also because the next pandemic will not wait, right? Will not wait for us to discuss extensively on for years and years. So I think that what we need is commitment from all the member states, all the delegations, to the agreed schedule. And also what we also need is probably, and I agree with Juliana, that we should make sure that we make use of this intersessional time between November and December, just like we did with the informals now in October with the resource persons. the experts, because we are now building something very complex. We are building now, we need a functional ABS system adaptable to the global health reality and needs. And of course, it exceeds my knowledge as a lawyer, my colleagues as diplomats. So I think it's very important that for us to meet the deadline, and not only to meet the deadline delivering anything, but meeting the deadline delivering something meaningful and an equitable system. I think it's important that we make use of our time, making use of all the support from the experts in genomics, virology, vaccine production, data sharing, issues of interoperability that has been very much discussed. So at this point, I think that for one of the main conditions for us to conclude it by May 2026 is making good use of our time, our intersessional time, with informal briefings with experts. That's very important.
So let me bring in Dr. Al-Ghassan, and then after that, Ms. Nur-Hafiza. And let's add another layer to this question. So in addition to some of these perceived challenges and what perhaps you think needs to be accomplished on IGWG 3, how are delegations balancing this need for detail in technically complex areas with the need to complete this agreement on time?
Thank you for the question. Actually, first of all, I want to second my colleague, dear colleague Maria. And I think the Bureau text is a constructive and unbalanced starting point. Yet it's not a final product, but it captured much of the convergence view that we've saw in the past informal discussions. And for my colleague, the issue about transparency, actually from the Eastern Mediterranean region perspective, and also alongside with the equity group as expressed in the last IGWG meeting, we've proposed that we allow the relevant stakeholders to attend as an observer, and this is, I think, a step forward in the transparency. And yes, I think we need a much transparency in this negotiation in comparison with other UN system consultations and negotiations. Back to the point, I think we are currently on combination with the urgency and the realism that we are facing. There is a broad recognition that the annex is a prerequisite of the adoption by the next assembly. The timeline is very compressed. We cannot attempt to solve every technical details now. Actually, our priorities going to the IGWG is from our perspective, the scope clarity. PABS must clearly cover both the physical material and sequence information with traceability and the using of identifiers, and to avoid actually the fragmentation or a leakage pathway. The operation, all components, sharing, contracts, benefits, must activate together, not in stages. Also, as mentioned in my previous intervention, the contract architecture. This is the mechanism that translates political intent to enforceable commitments and actions. And we must also avoid overloading the annex with the implementation details. The annex should establish the legal and operation architecture, while in our view that we allow the conference of party, the COP, to develop the modalities and the technical details. This actually, in our view, is how to finish on time with a substance, not just in a text.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Ghassan. Ms. Nur-Hafiza, you'll have the last word on this topic before we ask some of the civil society, some James and Sangeeta, to give their perspective on what needs to be achieved in this compressed timeline to protect equity. But before we do that, what is your view on how delegations should balance the need for detail in technically complex areas with the need to conclude the agreement on time, and how can discussions of governance be advanced to perhaps address this issue post-adoption?
Thank you. So for us, concluding the PABS Annex by the target deadline will only be, for us, it will be possible if the negotiations is built upon established and proven practice rather than reopening or weakening existing principles that have already demonstrated their effectiveness. So we already have successful precedents, notably the PEEP framework, which offer practical lessons on how to operationalize timely access and fair benefit sharing. However, as you know, the current draft that was prepared by Bureau appears to be moving backwards instead on building on what already works. I think this regression makes it increasingly difficult to achieve consensus and meet the agreed timeline. For example, the use of SMTAs are used in PEEP framework and other international ABS system. These are already well and understood concept and functional. So there is no need to reason for hesitation or reinvention. User registration is also used in GSAID database and proven well. So if we continue to dilute proven mechanism or reopen fundamental principles, I think we risk losing both momentum and trust. And also, I think it's essential to distinguish between creating normative rules and defining operational dimensions, because sometimes I think we lose in that debate. We're mixing up. I mean, here we are creating normative rules, and I think we understand that there's a layer of complexity, but this is why I think COP will have to deal with that's why COP can function and deal with that matter. But I don't think we should deter ourselves from making this core normative principle in the PABS Annex to operationalize some of these benefit sharing obligations. Yes, thank you for now.
Thank you. So let me turn to Sangeeta, and given what was just laid out by the member states, and given the objectives that your organization has, and like we do also for equity, what are some of these essential components that need to be protected in the text? Or what are some key provisions that you view that are non-negotiable and that member states should look out to preserve, and without, while balancing the need for detail and also the need for preserving language that protects those provisions? I don't know if my question made sense.
Thank you very much for the question. So I think we have heard repeatedly. First, most important is one of the key important areas is standard contracts, whether you call it SMTAs or you call it standard contracts. And here, I just want to echo what Nur Hafiza has said. We are not starting from scratch. We have got more than a decade experience with SMTA 1 and SMTA 2. SMTA 1 is governing the sharing of materials within the laboratories. SMTA 2 is for outside the laboratories. There are very clear terms and conditions, not just benefit sharing, but terms and conditions, terms of use, how to address intellectual property, how do you deal with onward transfer to other recipients. We have this experience in the PIP framework. So the standard contracts governing the sharing of PABS material and sequence information are very important. The additional part from the PIP framework would be the addressing the issue, the handling of sequence information. Sequence information was not fully addressed in the PIP framework, and here we need to consider the possibility having user registration, identifying the users, and also having data access agreements. These are all elements that are actually been operation for almost more than a decade in the context of sharing of influenza viruses. So the challenge we are now facing is that when we look at the text of the Bureau, presumably because of the opposition we are facing from especially the European Union, we find a lot of these are absent in the draft text, right? But the question then to the European Union is, why are you opposing these elements? Because it's there in the PIP framework. If you look at what all of the European laboratories do, they also use standard material transfer agreements when it comes to sharing of biological materials from their laboratories. And they are supporters of a model that GSET implements, which is data access agreement and user registration. And we have already discussed, in the informals, these tools do not hinder access. They're about facilitating access, making sure there's transparency and accountability. I think it's very important to note that, if we are going to have legal certainty in terms of how the materials and sequences are used, if we are going to hold the users accountable in terms of making sure they don't misappropriate it, making sure that they are compliant, making sure that there is benefit sharing, we do need to have these tools in place. In the absence of this, then there is going to be a very dysfunctional system. The final point I wanted to make is that, if you look at Article 12, Article 12 does speak about having modalities, terms and conditions for access and benefit sharing that have legal certainty. Article 12 also talks about making sure that, establishing a PABS system, but the idea of the annex is to have it, all the different elements decided, in a way that it is operational. So I think the challenge we are going to be facing, and we see already that in the Bureau's text, is to start parking different things, in the future. And I think in doing so, the problem we are going to be facing is, firstly, we are not creating a system that is effective because we are negotiating it in bits and pieces rather than looking at the system as a whole, how it would function, how it would contribute to pandemic preparedness and response. So I think these are all the elements that we need to consider, especially to know that we are not starting from scratch. When the PIP framework was negotiated, they were starting from scratch, but we are not. We have got this kind of experience that we have behind us, which was not there when the PIP framework was actually being negotiated. And a lot of the arguments that are put forward at this moment actually arguments were already made during the PIP framework negotiation. So these are nothing new. Things like, this is going to hinder R&D, this is going to make this difficult, that difficult. None of them has actually come through. In fact, I think it has actually facilitated access and it has given legal certainty for how WHO should act, how member states should act, and given greater transparency and, even enabled flu pandemic preparedness. So I think these are good steps to follow as we move on with the negotiations.
So James, let me bring you in and broaden a little bit the scope of the question. And I'm going to ask that you be brief because I'd like to pick your brain with regard to two things before we finalize. But the first of these issues, before we turn to the role of civil society in the process, has to do with the industry. The industry has been a double-edged sword, particularly with regard to global South countries that see this as an instrument, as a pathway of building equitable local manufacturing capacity, and as an opportunity to advance the transfer of technology and know-how to the global South, to, as Dr. Okasan has put at the beginning, transform the global South into a producer rather than just a consumer. In your view, how far should obligations go with regard to benefits and contributions? And what leverage do member states have to bring the industry to the table through this agreement? And is perhaps the PABS the most ideal fighting ground for some of these issues of equity?
Well, first, the PABS is important, and when you have something like COVID, like really important. But it's also the exception. I mean, it's not like something that will be relevant most of the time. So, I mean, I think it's important that you have equity provisions in the pandemic treaty, but that shouldn't be the only place you have equity. I mean, it's because it's a fairly narrow set of cases when it would apply. That would be one thing. There is a lot of manufacturing capacity in the South, but sometimes they can't use it because they don't have rights to use patents or something like that. It's also not uniformly distributed everywhere, obviously. I mean, you have, a lot of manufacturing in India and China, and you have several other countries, in Latin America or Asia have and some countries in Africa have pretty decent manufacturing capacity. But in order I think the pandemic highlighted the fact that the countries that had manufacturing capacity got preferential access compared to the countries that did not have it. You saw that with India blocking exports, with the U.S. demanding that the German technology for its vaccine be transferred to the United States. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on in terms of trying to health security that was related specifically to pandemics. That doesn't necessarily apply to other things. It was not an issue for HIV. For HIV, almost all the drugs were made in India, and that was not really a problem. For the pandemic situation, where there was a shortage, it was a problem. So it really somewhat depends on the situation. I know that, it's not simple, right? So you have to kind of look at the context, I think, to figure out what needs to be done. I think people want to see more technology transfer. Interestingly enough, the Europeans and the Americans, the G7 countries, they stopped claiming you can't issue a compulsory license in a kind of global norm. They lobby against it in practice. I mean, they put pressure on countries not to do it in practice, but they don't really argue you can't do it. But they've shifted their lobbying in the international negotiations to try and block transfers of know-how. And that's what you saw really a bitter fight about in the pandemic treatment. And the G7 Plus is trying to elevate their attack on any kind of mandated or regulated transfer of manufacturing know-how, not just in this agreement, but across the board. And I think that's very, very dangerous. It's also the case that European and American, other, like high-income countries, they don't promise not to do it themselves. I mean, everything Trump is doing right now is to move more manufacturing back to the United States. And you see the European compulsory licensing thing, for emergencies, really has an ability to make sure that they can address things. So the U.S. has pretty broad authority to force and mandate sharing of manufacturing know-how, as some other countries do too. So it's now legally you can do the IP rights through whatever kind of rules you think apply to you internationally, but there's this attempt to change the global rules to make it seem like you can't do it for know-how.
Thank you, James. And to close off our discussion, I'm going to shift the topic to civil society participation. Maybe Sangeeta or James can offer a couple minutes of observations as to the importance of having us in the room, and maybe we can then shift to some of the participants. I know that Brazil, for example, has been a strong supporter of civil society. Malaysia, Colombia. I'm unsure of the position of Kuwait, so maybe they can add that. But we've been, active participants throughout the entire process. And I know that there's maybe the possibility for greater participation at the upcoming IGWG. So I'll first open the floor to Sangeeta on a few words regarding civil society, and maybe to others who want to contribute to this discussion to close us off.
So I think we've been having this discussion since the beginning of INB. I think, you see, at the end of the day, it's an intergovernmental process. It is really a call for member states to make. But what I would say is civil society, we play a very, very important role in these negotiations throughout the INB. I'm sure many of you all would have appreciated, maybe not, the input that civil society have given. We participate as observers, make statements, plenary. I think highlighting areas that have been overlooked. We monitor negotiations, research, analysis, even communicating about the negotiations. But I think the reality in a lot of intergovernmental negotiations, and a lot of the intergovernmental negotiations in different forums like WIPO, they go on for very, very long, a decade, more than a decade negotiations. I've attended several of these negotiations, often not ending, never ending negotiations, right? They go on for very long, but it is true that when it comes to the decisive stage of drafting text, especially the last moments, when they're into the serious negotiations, they often do not open the proceedings to observers. Now, in the context of the PABS negotiations, when we talk of stakeholders, it's not just civil society. It's also academia, industry, private sector. I mean, there's a long list of stakeholders, of actors that are stakeholders in the PABS negotiations. And some of these do not necessarily share the view of having a fair, effective, accountable PABS system. So it's a difficult thing to, note, and it can, like I think it was mentioned by Jamie, yes, diverse views can complicate maybe the discussions, can be a distraction. So it's really a call for member states. I think it is a decisive moment in the sense that we have a deadline. I think several speakers have mentioned it's a challenge. The time remaining before the World Health Assembly, the text that has to be concluded. And I've been speaking to some delegations. I think what I'm hearing is maybe they need to focus their efforts on having that discussions, achieving some agreement amongst member states, and reaching and completing the negotiations. I think whatever decision that is taken, I think this is like a critical point decision that is coming up at IGWG 3. Whatever decision is taken, it should not diminish the contribution of civil society. I think for civil society, we should still look for different meaningful ways for engagement and for making the voices heard. I think the issue of transparency that Jamie raised is very, very important. I think this also was raised during the INB, and maybe even having more, and I think that was there in the INB negotiations. Having more regular briefings also was part of the something that the Bureau, I think, did. But I think since then, that has also not happened. So I think there are different ways as well for improving transparency. So I would say that...
So we only have a couple of minutes left. I'll invite one of the member states representatives to maybe close us out, to give a message of hope for the upcoming negotiations. And then I'll transfer the word to Jacob to close out the webinar. Would anybody like to volunteer for this role about what is needed to ensure success in the PABS agreement? Roberta?
So yeah, just going back a little bit on the relevant stakeholders' participation, Brazil and other countries in the group for equity were very vocal advocating for more participation. So we'll see if it's going to happen, but we are very eager to seeing that happening. It's going to be decided now in IGWG 3. But I think it's a very important step towards more transparency in the process, and to safeguard the integrity of this instrument. But yeah, words of hope. I think that we are going now to enter text-based negotiations, and that's a very critical moment for us to advance the main issues that are pending, and now we have to advance very quickly. And yeah, if in the end, once we, I don't know, eventually we have another pandemic, and we look back and we see that our PABS system that we are designing now is effectively working with for equitable benefit access to pathogens and benefit sharing on equal footing. I think we are going to be truly happy that we made a difference by having this negotiation. So looking forward to IGWG 3 and possibly with the participation of relevant stakeholders. So, thank you very much.
Dr. Al-Kashan, would you like to say a few words? I believe you're muted.
Thank you so much. Just a final word from our side. I think we must shift from sharing products during crisis to sharing capability before crisis. And this is, in our view, how the PABS leads to real preparedness rather than a reactive response in the pandemic. Thank you so much.
Nur Hafiza or Dr. Maria Juliana, would you like to say 1 minute as a closing remark?
Yes, I think in our view, the success of the PABS system will depend on our collective ability to build a framework that fosters mutual trust, transparency, and genuine partnership among member states. I think the idea that we're sharing pathogens, which is a public investment, as we are using our own resources to conduct surveillance, to detect and share these pathogens. There are actually inputs to the vaccine development. So that's why it has to be translated into benefit sharing obligations under the PABS system. And we also want that all participants, particularly provider countries, feel respected, valued, and empowered, because we need to dispel the notions that only developed countries can produce vaccine. Actually, there's a lot of capabilities in developing countries, and a lot of countries are gearing towards having a more regionalized vaccine manufacturing to prepare for the pandemic preparedness. So these should all be stipulated. Should all be considered under the PABS system because. The idea, we need to take the lessons learned during COVID-19. So we do need to improve and make PABS system functional. Thank you.
Dr. Maria Juliana?
Okay, so I know that we're running out of time. So basically, our message is that we need to work collectively. And when we say collectively, it means all us member states, but also the relevant stakeholders. Basically, we're putting a collective effort to deliver an effective instrument towards a global common, that is global health. So if we're not putting our efforts towards that goal, I don't think we were going to make it. And we saw it during the pandemic agreement, and we could do it against all odds. So we have to trust ourselves, trust in the process, trust in the leadership of the Bureau, and give our best effort to be able to deliver the annex on time. And because in our view, it is very important, because without that, we won't have a pandemic agreement. So that's our efforts are being put on that task, and we are very hopeful that on May 2026 we will be able to open for signatures the pandemic agreement along with the PABS Annex. And thank you for the opportunity for this seminar.
And with that message of hope, I'd like to thank each and every one of the participants for being here and sharing with us this time. I look forward to seeing all of you in Geneva. And I will now hand over the word to Jacob to close us off.
Thanks so much, Guy. So on behalf of the University of Miami Public Health Policy Lab and the AHF Global Public Health Institute, I extend our sincere gratitude to Mr. Favero for his thoughtful moderation and our distinguished panelists for their valuable participation. Dr. Al-Kashan, Ms. Md Hamza, Mr. Love, Ms. Shashikant, Dr. Tenero Quintero, and Ms. Vargas de Moraes, thank you so much for sharing your time and your tremendous insights on the WHO Pandemic Agreement, Equity, and the PABS Annex. In closing, we invite everyone to stay tuned for updates from our Emerging Challenges in Global Public Health webinar series, including our upcoming session on the importance of Latin American Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, to be held mid-November. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.